Hello everyone. Welcome to our third installment of the Economic Democracy Initiative's summer series, Democratizing Work After the Pandemic. My name is Pavlina Cherneva. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bard College, a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute, and I direct the Economic Democracy Initiative at Open Society University Network. Today I have a very special guest. I have the honor of introducing to you Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song, who is an engineer by training and has been working on job creation for the last 20 years. Since 2015, Maikel has worked at the International Labour Organization in its employment intensive investment program as a senior technical specialist, where he focuses on optimizing the employment outcomes of public investment. Now, between November 2003 and August 2008, he was the chief director of the South African government of the Expanded Public Works Program, which created over 1.6 million jobs in 5 years. He was involved since the inception of this program, worked on the design, on building the EPWP unit at the Department of Public Works. And he worked on the review of the first 5 years and the design of the second phase, which started in April in 2009. This program has been of great research interest to me, as it provides an interesting, important insights in how public employment programs can be up and running for the potential pathway or become a potential pathway to employer of last resort programs or job guarantee proposals. Maikel has been engaged in civil engineering and international development since 1995, and particularly in the field of infrastructure development, employment creation, and small business development. Though he entered the field as an engineer, his engagement has expanded into research, policy formation, program design, implementation and program management, review, assessment, monitoring, evaluation. I don't think there is an aspect to this work that you haven't done, Maikel. He has worked as a project engineer in the private sector, as a university researcher, as a director of an NGO, and as a senior civil servant. And it's just such an honor to have you here with us today. Welcome, Maikel.
Thank you very much, Pavlina, for your introduction. And good, I guess it's morning, afternoon, I'm not sure where everybody is. Thank you for having me. Welcome to this session this afternoon. As I was preparing for this, I struggled a little bit because I wasn't quite sure where to take you guys today. There are many directions. I had a look at what other people are covering in this series, and so I'm taking this democratizing work perspective. I'm not going to link it too much to the pandemic. I'm going to talk about I'm going to break it down in two parts, as I'll explain. One, something a bit more general that sketches background, but also gives some food for thought around democratizing work and the role of employment and the detrimental role of unemployment in the whole notion of democratizing work. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit on South Africa about the work that I was involved in at the time. And this then, hopefully will give you some, nice balance between two parts, something a bit more general and something quite specific. And then, let's see where it takes us. I probably have too many slides, but I'm going to pace myself, so don't worry. I had to dust up a few slides. As Pavlina explained, it's been a while since I worked in the EPWP. It's still running as a program, and I'll say a little bit at the end about that, because I'm not completely disconnected from it. But but it's not really, I think, what's happening today. I would rather have, as I explained, rather have other people talk about that. So I'm gonna switch to my presentation. I think there are too many of us to have introductions, so I don't think that's.
I should say that people are joining us from virtually every continent except maybe Australia and yeah, the Arctic. But we have we have students from Asia. We have from Taiwan, Myanmar, Afghanistan. We've I think we may have somebody from South Africa also joining us. We have from Berlin, you know, countries in Europe. We also have some guests that I don't know where they're from, but North America, of course, the United States. So.
Great. Okay, so that's why I think that's great. So I think this balance of between general and specific is hopefully of interest to everybody. So the title of the I'm going to talk about is employment matters too much to leave the markets alone. It really matters too much to society to leave the markets alone. It's partially based on a chapter of a book that I think was at least made available to you. I don't know if everybody's able to have a look at it. But then I also reflect a little bit on this notion within the context of the EWP in South Africa. So as I explained, my name is Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song. I work with the ILO. So I'm going to do two things, as I mentioned. So first, I'll talk a little bit about full employment, labor markets, employment guarantee schemes. I'll frame this partially in the sense of the social contract. Talk a little, and then in the second part, I'll talk about South Africa and a bit of the origins of the expanded public works program, or the EWP. So before I start, just quickly about where I work now, about the ILO, as I mentioned, and the International Labour Organization, and this employment intensive investment program that I work in. So for those who are not familiar with it, when you talk about the democratizing work, I think ILO is quite probably the UN agency most concerned with that. We are actually pre-UN, as I explained here. We're the only tripartite UN agency, so we consist of governments, employers, and unions as our members from the 187 member states. And our main role is really to set labor standards. So we set what we call international labor standards, but we develop policies and devise programs. And our main aim is really to promote rights at work, encourage decent employment opportunities, enhance social protection, and strengthen dialogue on work-related issues, and what we call social dialogue. And I think we, from the kind of ILO perspective, of course, social dialogue and the democratizing of work are really part of the same or essential parts of this. Now, public works and our public employment programs, what I'll be talking about is something that is interesting. I'm working on a book actually on the history of ILO and public works. And it's from the very first recommendation in 1919 already that public works was included in the very first. This was post World War I, which was when the ILO was founded, and half the world was in reconstruction mode or trying to recover from this war. And back then already public works was seen as an important instrument to reconstruct and address some of the negative legacies of the war. So we see it as instruments of achieving full employment, reducing unemployment, but also supporting the transition from unemployment to employment. And this is reflected in some of our current, these are all, we have as international labor standards, really conventions and recommendations. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but we have a number of convention recommendations specifically refer to public works and public employment programs and their role as we see it in addressing unemployment. So public employment programs, so we're a little bit on the same page. They go by really many different names. Concrete, I think universally accepted definition still partially eludes us, but some people call them public works program, cash for works programs. The World Bank likes to call them productive safety nets. Some employment guarantees are a specific kind, but essentially the government programs to create jobs. I think that's the essential element. And they usually do that in a context where markets do not create employment on the required scale. they can be seen as wider employment and social protection policy, and this is a little bit they can fit in both, and in some contexts people see them more as, or some people see them more from a social protected lens. We prefer to see them more from an employment lens, but that's also for debate. But the three things they do, and I think this is quite important, is they provide some assets and services. So they do some work, typically because they're government funded, they provide assets and services provided by the government. They offer work, employment, and they offer income, and to that they offer income security. So those are the three things that they must do. If you don't have those, you don't do all three, you don't talk about it. A public employment program as such. Now, unemployment, of course, and if you go back to the first recommendation of ILO, the public works, the reason was included was as a recommendation to address unemployment. Now, we all know employment has huge social costs. I'm not going to go into all of these elements here, and I think some of the speakers probably you have had or are coming will have talked about some of these elements. But I think an important part of here is also that, apart from all these negative impacts, is it also limits workplace participation. So if you are unemployed, you are not able to participate in the workplace. And so then the question about how do you democratize work if you're not in work becomes, of course, hugely problematic. So of its many roles are many negative consequences of unemployment and the social cost. One of them, of course, is also the limits on workplace participation, in addition to all these other impacts here that we have seen and that probably many of you are familiar with. So the theme then is that really employment matters too much to society to leave the markets alone. And I think here we specifically talk about markets as a construct, societal construct. And I think this is quite important, that I think in many mental models, markets are often seen as a given, it's something that you don't shape or create, but it's something that's a given and you try and operate within a market. But I think this is where we challenging that notion. And actually markets are social constructs. And actually what I'm going to talk about is that these programs can influence how markets function. And so we see this instrument to shape the market so that the market provides the outcomes that we like, rather than us being kind of slaves to the market, so to speak, and trying to fit, respond to a market that perhaps doesn't deliver the outcomes that we would like. So full employment, and I see you had a lecture on this, so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but it's there in many of our policy documents in the UN. We have ILO Convention 122, which where everybody is committed to full employment. There's the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs where full employment is there. But in practice, there has been a shift here. I think we have had, in simplified terms, up to the 70s, often we've seen that full employment was often the overarching goal of economic policy, and at least in many countries in the developed world, unemployment was kept quite low. But then we have seen somehow, and this is debated, but we have seen a shift in many instances where the responsibility of unemployment has partially shifted from it being a societal problem to a problem of the individual. So we have seen in many contexts and many policies reflect this, that it was no longer this collective goal to keep unemployment low, but actually that if you were unemployed, that was your fault. You were not skilled enough, you were not looking hard enough for work, you were not, rather than society is, the economic system we're in is not functioning, is not creating all the jobs we want. So we've seen that from a policy side, we've seen a very much commitment in some ways from full employment towards much more focus on employability. And so we see the problem, it's a problem of the individual, not of society. People, if you don't have a job, then either have to find one or if you have to become an entrepreneur. And this is, of course, nice, but it's not really feasible for everybody. And I think there is a question of how do we shift policies back so that there's a balance here. Of course, there's always an individual dimension to it, but also our policies need to shift in line to come back to this accepted notion of full employment. Now, why? Well, because there's the different elements here, and I think this is a cultural dimension or there's a cultural dimension to the meaning of work in society. But in many societies and in most countries, participation in work provides the living, and if you don't work, you're not going to survive. In the richer countries, perhaps there's some social safety net, but in many poor countries, if you don't work, you're not going to survive. But there's many more. It's also the means of contributing to your household and to your community. And this is where we talk about the social contract, that actually the social contract is your role in most countries, what we call the social contract is your participation. Your role as individual is to work and to contribute to society, pay taxes, and return government then as part of the contract under some of its obligations, offers you safety, it offers you infrastructure, it offers your kids' education. But there is this inherent, this often accepted role. And if you're not working, you're not living up to the social contract in many societies. And you're seen as somebody who's, well, depending where you are, whether it's a failure or somebody who's a free rider, or there's a lot of negative stereotypes. It's a marker of transition to adulthood in many societies. If you're not working, if you're a child, you're not supposed to work. But it's actually when you start working and taking care of yourself, you become an adult. Now, what happens if you never get to work? Do you then become a member of? Are you seen as an adult in your society? Are you seen as a full member of society? And this is particular for males. Actually, interestingly, a bigger problem in many countries where actually the stereotype or the expectations that men make this shift is often higher in society. So if they fail to do this notion of failure is even stronger for them. But the workplace and also the marketplace, it's important for networks. Beyond the family, for many people, some of their main social connections are through the workplace. The way they interact with other people, other cultures comes through the workplace. The workplace has been a huge driver of gender equity, and hopefully will get even stronger. And of course, economic participation builds many capacities, life skills, discipline, teamwork, etc. Now, if you're not working, many of these things are actually excluded from many of these dimensions. Now, finally, also, and this is something I've been looking for a long time since I'm working in this area, but can we show that this dimension of work are important? That we all know that work, the income part is, we all know it's important, and we work because we want income, and this is the kind of promotes the most important benefit. But actually, we've always been arguing that there is more to work than just the money, because otherwise you could just have money, give everybody money, and everybody would be equally happy. And this has, evidence of this has eluded us in many cases. So actually, I just want to, there's this paper that just came out recently. This is done on experiments, actually. It's in a Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, where they had different people who were giving cash transfers, people giving work, etc. And actually, it kind of really clearly shows that there is value well beyond the income that you derive from work, that comes from work. And this is then an important role again for why employment guarantees or public employment programs are important, because they provide more than income. They provide a whole set of secondary benefits, which are often for a functioning society as important. So if employment is left to markets alone, then markets are not going to determine the outcome, and it's going to be and not us. And so I think the question is then what is the role of the state and society in shaping markets so that they give us this outcome? And so from a labor markets perspective and from employment perspective, of course, the state has many instruments to shape the markets. It has, and what I call Plan A, it has all these policies that use macro policies, industrial policy, development finance, investment, labor market policies, which it's used to shape the market. But actually, even with all those instruments, there's often still not enough, and there's still unemployment, and there's still unemployment. So what I call Plan A++ is actually that in addition to these there is a need for the state to have a role to offer some forms of direct employment. And what we then call public employment programs or employment guarantees to take it to the level of the state as employer of last resort. Because generally, Plan A alone doesn't really give us the outcome that's sufficient that, what we want. So, and we have this because they can end, so PEPs can end or reduce involuntary unemployment and unemployment, but also importantly provide alternatives to the worst forms of informal work. So I think this is really the role that we need to think about. So, but how exactly can they do this? So I just want to spend some time on that. Say, okay, well, these programs, they have been around. What exactly is their role in shaping markets, labor markets in particular? So first, obviously, the main thing they do is they offer employment. And I saw also that there will be a lecture specifically on this program in India, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. But again, the most important role of this program is that it actually offers paid employment up to 60 million households per year. But it has many other impacts as well. So shaping the market by paying minimum wages. And because it's paying minimum wages, it's pushing up wages in the rest of the labor market. So it's an effect that's way beyond its direct employment effect. By paying equal wages to men and women, it's also helping to close the gender wage gap in rural India. So this is another contribution. So these spill over well beyond just the people who work. And it's providing people, most importantly, with alternatives. And there's, again, a very interesting paper that came out now recently on this. And it shows that NREGAs have huge spillovers into the rest of the labor market. That it benefits actually are many, the benefits of the direct employment are only a very small fraction of the overall economic benefits of the program because of these spillovers, because of this pushing up of wages across the rest of rural India. Now, these programs also provide stimulus from below by supporting a lot of other things. And so again, this is then looking beyond the direct jobs it offers, but because there's more income, people do all these things and create additional employment income. Can help provide a pathway out of informality. Now, I think, again, this is for, depending where you come from, informal work may or may not be a huge issue, but in many countries it is. And so by offering paid work and introducing elements of formality into what is otherwise an informal workspace, whether it's the first written contract or the first time people have access to occupational health and safety, or the first time they receive formal training as part of their work, these programs are able to provide a pathway out of informality, especially if they work in sectors that are primarily informal. And this is actually in South Africa, where one of the sub-programs of EWP, the Community Works Program, one of the things they do is provide care to the elderly. And this was a activity that was almost entirely informal, often volunteers on paid work. And actually, by turning this into paid work and introducing levels of informality, you have partially a whole sector that's kind of shifting out from being informal into formal. And in the process also setting standards for care, because all of a sudden you have the government, by entering the care sector, and this is another part of the program, this early childhood development, by entering the care sector, it has the ability to start shaping the sector. It has the ability to start putting in standards. While in the past, this was a sector that's completely informal, the government has no lever to influence it. Now by coming in, by paying some of the wages of people there, it's actually able to also start introducing minimum standards into some of this work. Displacement, this is a huge issue that's probably only going to unfortunately get worse. So again, interesting, the paper I referred to earlier in about the value of work is actually in a refugee camp, and it kind of shows even more starkly the importance of work actually in a context where people have nothing to do and the opportunities are so limited, so that work then becomes an even more important dimension. Then in terms of social protection, and I think there is often a discussion here, and there's sometimes intellectually often there's even a competition sometimes between people who advocate a universal basic income and people who advocate for a employment guarantee scheme, and we have to choose between one or the other. And actually, yes, to some extent, but probably in most countries, it's going to be dimensions of both that are going to be actually finding their way through. And the real challenge often is going to be, how do you design these programs so they're complementary, so that you have those who need social protection are not able to work are still covered, but that those who are willing and able to work have an avenue to improve their livelihoods and actually go beyond the kind of levels of minimum income that a UBI would be able to measure up. As in the end, I think, as I say here, few people want to rely on minimum incomes all their whole life. So most people will have an ambition. So even if they have an UBI, they would like to move beyond that, and the main avenue through moving beyond that will again be work. Now, PEPs can also shape labor markets so this is then shaping the social protection debate. It can also shape the active labor market policy debate, because they are in fact have this function of labor market policies. They maintain and provide work skills and maintain work readiness. It can reduce erosion of productivity with long-term unemployment. And at the same time, they offset the same negative impacts that many active labor market policies want. So they also have their tentacles into that ALMP space. And then I think maybe from this thematic of building of democratizing work, I think an important potential role of public employment is really what role they can build in the commons. And so we are seeing already that some of the facts of technology we've concerned with, and the pandemic has made that perhaps even more clear that we are social beings and we want social interaction. And unemployment is a lonely space. And so the role these programs also have is to bring people together, is to see it as a social instrument where people can collaborate and work together to improve their communities and their societies. And PEPs can be the instrument to make that work. And they can be, and because they offer paid work, they can also be an instrument to make it attractive for people to engage. So you're not engaging in community not only because it's your community, but also because you actually are paid to do so. Now, one important dimension of that, and this is using this process to not only democratize work, but also saying what is the work that needs to be done. And so this is really because I think our experience, it is mine and many others who work in this area, that actually there's often no shortage of work to be done if you are in a community and ask people what it is that needs doing. But there needs to be a process of allowing people to imagine work to be done, and imagine that things that they know should be done, but there's no institution or system to bring that out, that these programs can play this role. So this is and so there's a lot of creativity that often comes out when people say, okay, what is it we pay you, but you need to think of things that need to be done in your community. And this then brings us a little bit into this notion of placemaking. I don't know, this is an interesting kind of school of thought that has, or line of work, let me put it that way, that has emerged recently, where placemaking is really say, okay, let's take a geographical space, and what is it that what activities can we be involved in to improve that place? And these are just some examples. This is typical of a placemaking type approach, where you say, okay, we're living in this community, what work needs to be done? And communities start coming together, they quickly arrive at something like this, and this can be much more expanded, but they say, okay, we can look in the art and culture space, for example, and what can we do in the art and culture space? Well, we can do public art, or we can do music and concerts for people, or we can do community drama. Some people can write the plays, some people can do the plays. We can support cultural heritage, we can restore the church, we can record histories. So within that space, then all of a sudden, a lot of activities of work are possible. And this you can imagine on a much larger scale, and actually a public employment program being the kind of the instrument and the institution that underpins it. Because all of a sudden, whatever this work is, there's an instrument to actually reward it and pay for it and provide a structure for it to happen. So this is then on the first part. I'm just going to conclude then really to say, okay, so we said that we try to make the case that employment matters too much, decided to leave the markets alone. Because if the market alone acts, it may say, well, the market, we have 15% unemployment, and that's what the market equilibrium is at the moment, and we all have to live with that. So let's challenge that notion. We'll argue that social contracts need a clear commitment to full employment, and this may then include direct forms of public employment if that's what is needed. But it's also a opportunity to reimagine how these programs can be. And I think in many of our imaginations, in many countries, it's seen as this, oh, we build some roads, or it's kind of infrastructure, and you have people with shovels who are building something, but actually we can collectively imagine much more. But we need to test, and we need to learn, and there is lots of work to be done. So finally, I'm going to leave a little bit with them, where I think, and this is a paper that I wrote with some other colleagues who have been working on this for a long time, but to think about, okay, what are we know a lot, but there's a lot to be learned still in terms of where we want to go. So first is, yes, we need to kind of get these things as a more permanent. So we see these things always pop up when there's a crisis, public employment, and a lot of support. Can we see them as an institutionalized response that grows and shrinks? If the economy is doing well and people have work elsewhere, then these programs will shrink. And this is actually also, interestingly, often an institutional challenge, because programs, and this is, and I can talk about it in separate things, but institutions have a notion, and bureaucracies have a tendency to preserve themselves. So even in South Africa, if the program shrinks, people think it's bad because it's shrinking, and we have to have ever-growing targets. But actually, an essential part of this, and this is a challenge, but from a conceptual side or from an institutional side, if a program shrinks because there's less demand, because people have better work elsewhere, then this is a positive thing, and it shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. So this is something that's kind of, and how do we build institutions that are readily accept the shrinking role is something that's what it's a challenge of experimentation. How do we use it as a labor standards floor, really? I think this is really from the ILO side ambition to say, well, we'd like these programs to be the floor. Nobody would take a job that's worse than this, because if you can always go to such a program, you always get a job that at least is standard. An employer would have to offer something better for them to get an employee. So in this role, they can really be meaningful. Instead of having labor inspectors, etc., you actually create an institution that does this. How do we synergize and integrate with other policies that are similar in the poverty space, minimum incomes, or social protection policies, etc.? How do we identify new forms of public value creation through new forms of work? So I think this is also, we have to also accept that some things are valuable. We have to accept that public art is something worth paying for, that tax money goes to it, it has a value in society. For example, I'm just saying that, but many other things. And through that, I think we can kind of have programs that really not only create jobs, but also strengthen the commons and provide avenues for a lot of other benefits in terms of forms of social engagement, allowing people to work and interact. So that's really the first part. And I'm actually not sure what's the best. I see we have half an hour, no? To have some pause here and maybe allow some questions or some comments, and then what do you, yeah? Would that be?
If you want to take questions now, that's fine. Let me just see if just somebody has a quick one or clarification. We talked a bit about public employment programs this morning as well.
Okay.
If anyone has a clarification, then maybe we should just leave to the end. Okay.
No.
Why don't we, why don't we go through the
It's
presentation and then leave?
all very clear. Or...
Yes, very clear.
And nobody knows what I'm talking about. But okay, let's continue. Okay, so I think that I'm gonna then I'm gonna shift it a little. So talk a little bit about some experience from South Africa. So these are as I mentioned, experiences when I was there. So this is early 2000s to late 2000s. And where we then started up this program called Expanded Public Works Program it's still around, and I'll talk a little bit about this, as mentioned in the end. So, but to give you a sense, I mean, this was the context. I mean, these are figures about 2007, and I mean, things have shifted, of course, and back then the numbers were slightly different, but we call this the South African onion. It really gives you a sense of the labor market. So you have full-time work, people who you call, properly employed, so to speak, have a contract. It's kind of formal work, formal full-time work. 6.6 million people. Then you had about half that were people who were working kind of outsourced, part-time, temp work, domestic work. So that gives you like 9 million people who are, almost 10 million people kind of working in properly, it's all subjective, but who are have some form of contract, etc. And then you had 2.2 million people in informal work, and then you had almost 8 million people unemployed. Now, this is a very extreme picture, perhaps. I mean, that many countries have such a dire situation, but economically, you have economically active population of 20 million. Around half was actually employed, and half was either informally employed or unemployed. And so the role of EPWP was to try and offer work to this large outer ring, the outside of the onion, to these 8 million unemployed people. And this was kind of the task set out. And as you can imagine, it's a very big task. But this at least gives you the kind of, if you see this, it's clear there's a rationale to create direct jobs. Because no matter how fast the economy grows, before it absorbs all these unemployed people, would take very long. So this was a little bit the way it was initially conceived. This was at the beginning that, it's part of course, there's all these other things that the government was doing to address unemployment. And these all need to be done. You need to have economic growth, absorb, you need to have better education, better enabling environment for investment, you need to improve social security. But all these things were being done, but not really the results. So then there is some role for direct intervention. The government spends money to reduce unemployment. And the question is really how do we had at the time? How do you go about it? What is the mechanisms? What are the instruments? How would you put that into place? So it wasn't at the beginning, we weren't seeing this wasn't going to solve this huge structural problem of 8 million people unemployed, but we were saying, okay, we need an additional avenue for labor absorption. So let's explore that and see how far we can push this. And because we need something, and it needs to produce a high volume of employment. I mean, maybe where we start can be more, but it needs to have this possibility to make a meaningful difference to the numbers that I presented earlier. So we had a few principles that would try and address this. Of course, we recognized there were many programs already that government was doing that had this nature. So we're not going to close all those down and start something new. We're going to say we're going to build on that. We're going to build on best practices. We were at that time, and this has shifted a little bit, by the time we say we're not going to have some special budget, but this has to become part of it has to be integrated into the different ministries, their budgets. They have to make this part of their own operations. And this is, we've partially come back to that thought, but this was at least at the time. Of course, it has to be sustainable, it must not be make work. But this is, of course, as I mentioned, it's an interesting question about what is make work, when is work economically, socially, culturally useful? Who determines what is useful and stuff? There's a lot to be explored there. But this was a principle, like, okay, it must be useful, and I think we moved a little bit farther from economically efficient was initially, but actually, you could argue now that we started at 2003 with economically efficient, and I think now, just last year, socially useful was perhaps the best term that you could say, that as long as it meets that criteria, it's worth doing. Avoiding displacement, I think, is important, because this is also it's one of the big criticisms of these programs, that you're just displacing people. So said, okay, we should take place in either sectors that are growing or sectors that are underdeveloped. And so, for instance, the care sector, I spoke about already, is hugely underdeveloped. So entering there is a lot. You're not competing with other sectors. There's no risk of displacement. So then you are. So that was one. There's competition very low. And of course, I think that the important dimension is that it's shifting this thing from seeing unemployed labor as a burden to seeing it as a resource. And say, okay, how can we mobilize unemployed labor to actually help deliver services rather than seeing it as something that just absorbs services. The last thing is really the GDS. That's a very South African thing. I'm not going to talk about it. So the scope then really we set out. I mean, it was decided that this is a program that all spheres of government should be able to contribute to. So then spheres, maybe a South African term, but so the national, or what you would US call the federal government, but also the state, provinces, and municipalities and local government. Everybody has to have a role. Everybody has to have a mechanism to participate and contribute. If it's just only national government, it's not going to get to the scale that we wanted. So that was one of the key elements. And the idea was that every, what we call a public body, whether it's a provincial government or a local government, must think about and come up with a plan of how they are going to draw in unemployed people into productive work. And so we started with 4 sectors then. We say, okay, we need to have these 4 these activities can take place in these 4 sectors. People can be employed in these 4 sectors. This is also to provide, it's not necessary to limit it, but it's provide some guidance to the different departments of where they could imagine these people working. So then, of course, there's infrastructure, there's environmental programs, there's environmental rehabilitation, cleaning up, there's a whole range of activities. There's the social, where especially home-based care and early childhood development were seen as two ones. And then there was what we call the economic sector at the time that was going to focus mostly on micro enterprises and procurement, but which was later on shifted to another set of activities. So these were then the targets. So it was for 1 million. We were supposed to offer at least in the first 5 years to employment to 1 million people. And it was broken down as these sectors. And they was very largely based on the plans and that we could determine at the beginning of the program. So you can see that it varies from sector to sector as well. So I know some of the, this is, these are numbers from 3 years in, but I mean, these targets were generally achieved. This was after 3 years. We were generally well on our way to achieving these targets. This was, yeah, we had also at the time, this is no longer the case, but we had some questions in the labor force survey to try and match that, show that what we were reporting, because we were based on reporting from the public bodies would report to us. Based on the reporting, there was also kind of a separate channel to try and at least verify to some extent that some of the figures we had were in the same ballpark, and that was the case. And then, so that was the first 5 years, and then we and I got talk a little bit politically towards the end when these targets were achieved. It was clear that the first 5 years we could what we had settled could be done. The question is where to next, and can we what happens in the next 5 years? So this is where this notion that this is at the time in India they had just launched the program, the National Employment Rural Guarantee Act, and so we then also tried to say, okay, can we have introduce this concept in South Africa as well, where the state then acts as this employer of last resort. This was also then the time of the 2008 financial crisis, and we saw government acting as this lender of last resort in many countries, saving banks by saying, if all else fails, we're going to step in and provide loans. So that's why we said, okay, well, can government play that same role if all else fails in the labor market? If in the financial market you can be the lender of last resort, why in the labor market can you not be the employer of last resort? And this found some, because of the times as well, some interest at the time. So there was this. So quite a lot of work we did at the time to try and put this in place. Now, an interesting thing, and this is where you get into perhaps into the politics of such a program, is of course the first reaction is always that people say, well, you can never afford that. It's going to be so expensive. You're just going to blow the budget. And so we tried to do some work in trying to figure out that what can you control this? The Treasury in South Africa is Ministry of Finance. I need to. You cannot ask for a blank check. How can you? What safeguards, if that's the right phrase? Can you imagine that this thing doesn't spiral out of control? And of course, this is and in many countries, of course, fiscal space is always the case. You're always competing with different ministries as well, and within a government context, every ministry always needs more money. So the case to make more money is it's a challenging part, and you have to fight. You have to elbow your way into the space, and you have to build your case. So we tried. So I think the first part. So there's 3 ways to really then manage this guarantee and try and say, okay, can we safeguard that it doesn't spiral out of control? And I think this is it. So one is you can offer the guarantee to specific groups, and then so you can say, okay, well, we offer it to youth, and depending how you youth, it can only be for women. It could be in rural areas like you had before in India, you had in Maharashtra state, which had an employment guarantee scheme for 30, 40 years, only for rural people. In South Africa at the time, they had these rural development nodes, which were kind of the poorest rural areas in the country. And saying, oh, you could imagine a guarantee only for people, residents in those areas. Perhaps that's a way to control the cost. You can do a household rather individual approach, and this comes then, the household approach comes something that comes more from the social protection world, so to speak, because employment is usually not something that employment belongs to the individual. You don't employ a household, you employ an individual in the kind of traditional sense. So, but in India, in the National Rural Employment Guarantee, the employment guarantee was offered to a household, and this is again a way to limit the fiscal outlay. It could be in women-headed households. There's a program in South Africa, in one province, which had done this, where you had a lot of violence in the transition in South Africa from in KwaZulu-Natal province from the transition to democracy. So you had a lot of women-headed households where men were lost in the violence, and there was a program that essentially offered employment guarantee to a group of those women, and they were employed to work on rural road maintenance, but they were essentially employed part-time on an almost indefinite basis. Or you could do it again in households. And then of course the third mechanism to limit the cost is to say, okay, well, can you limit the scope of the guarantee? So it doesn't have to be a full-time guarantee, but maybe it's 100 days per year, like you have in India. So you don't have an entitlement to full-time job, you have an entitlement to 100 days. Or we were running pilots in South Africa at the time, which was 50 days, but it was based on 2 days a week. So you could then say, okay, we don't offer you full-time, but you're guaranteed 2 days of the week or of employment, so you can. So these were all strategies to say, okay, how can we get this thing off the ground? And then at the time, there's also this work going on in employment scenarios. That wasn't us who did that, but these were basically saying, okay, well, if we look 10 years ahead, if the economy grows at this rate or that rate, and we have some sectors growing, what are the kind of figures we can be looking at? And I mean, the point was that whatever scenario you picked, and actually all of these scenarios in the end turned out to be more optimistic than in reality. But no matter what scenario you pick in terms of the next 10 years employment, there's going to be a role for such a program. I think one could not conceive a scenario where you wouldn't be able to argue that it wouldn't be a role for a program like this. So I think that was also kind of a useful way of thinking about it. And and you can see it maybe there on these figures. South Africa at the time had this narrow and broad definition of employment, but that's basically if you wanted to work but you stopped looking for work, then you were not included in the narrow definition and you fell to the broad definition. So, but if you use the broad definition, then the numbers were even a lot starker, but that's maybe going into much detail. And of course, the other thing is the wage. And we tried to do some work on that. This was kind of a wage model that we tried to develop at the time based on household survey data, consumption data, to say, well, if you offer, of course, the higher your wage you offer in employment guarantee, the more people are going to be interested in working in employment guarantee. There's a market dimension there. And so what is the wage you could offer to, or can you play with a wage to also try and limit perhaps the scope and the fiscal outlay. This was before there was a minimum wage in South Africa, so there was no official minimum wage to peg it to. There were only sectoral minimum wages. And so we used at the time, the 40 Rand was the old age pension. So that's a state pension somebody who's over 65 gets from the state. And we used that kind of as a benchmark of, what is a kind of a minimum living kind of standard that you could imagine other ones. And then we tried to see how they would shift. So there's another kind of tool. So these are perhaps also kind of, and we talk about these programs are kind of, I would say design tools, but these are the kind of critical questions that one asks, and one needs to be able to respond, like, okay, what wage you're going to pay, and what is it going to mean? What, what are the rules? Who's eligible? How much work are they going to be offered? What are people going to do? I think these are all kind of critical questions. And again, at the time, the ambition we were working on was to halve unemployment. This was also just maybe to put it at the top there, but to halve. So I think the government had set this goal of, say, we're not going to zero unemployment, we're going to have unemployment from a certain, and again, this can also be, what's your entry point there in terms of what overall policy goal do you want these programs perhaps to contribute to that you want to think about. So quickly, and where we are today is a whole other story on its own, and I think there are other people who can talk about that, but so the EPLBP has continued to grow. We had just as a sense, we had this 5-year target for 1 million jobs. Now it is an annual target of 1 million jobs, but there was never an actual employment guarantee instituted. So there was never a law. There was never a. So it remains. There's no legal commitment from the government to do this, but they're doing a lot. It remains the main instrument to reach the unemployed. especially though, I mean, of course, there's those who have been formally unemployed are able to get unemployment benefits because they contribute to unemployment insurance, but those who are in the informal sector or who haven't worked don't really have any means to. It's interestingly then very recently there was, with COVID-19, there was, need for equality to respond, and it responded, but it didn't perhaps respond as actively as it could. So then, and this is also then partially political thing, then the government and the president said, okay, then we need a supplementary program. So they started this, it's called a presidential employment stimulus, which runs in parallel, and is, it's another 500,000 people, so to speak, employed by that program. And that's based, interestingly, on this broader notion, as I said earlier, of social employment. So that it's not saying we need efficient employment and it's productive, but it's kind of has to respond to social, has to address social needs. And that's again, it became the main criteria. Interesting, one of the most interesting elements of that is, to give examples, that it has put in place, employed lots of high school graduates to become teacher aides in many, in many schools, rural schools in South Africa, where teachers have very large classrooms, are unable to cope. With COVID, it became more complicated. So you have about 300,000 teacher aides who have been put in place in 5 months, who are now working alongside a teacher, each teacher as a teacher aide. And so there's, again, responding to a very clear need, but a need that one has to recognize as a need, and and say, okay, we are willing to commit to something like that. So that's, I think, that's the last one. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop sharing. So yeah, thank you very much, and let's see if there's any questions or
Thank you. Thank you, Maikel. Thank you for sharing this experience. It's we had this discussion right before you walked in. How do we respond to the pandemic, and how do we use these programs, and are they going to be disrupted? And I use this example all the time for the US, where teachers had to teach their own kids and Zoom teach our kids, and it was just overwhelming for everyone around. And the teacher aide is one of those examples that I often use. I'm gonna let our guests and students ask questions, but I wanna start off the discussion with a couple of questions. The first one really relates to your latter point on the legal mandate. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, the new constitution, South African constitution, has in it the right to employment as part of the mandate. And it is typical of a lot of post-war constitutions, especially after the UN Declaration. So it's interesting that there's language like that. Obviously, we don't have policies that are there, apart from the legally codified right in India, right? I mean, it's still not true. Right. But at least it's legal. So did you, in your experience, when you were launching and designing the program, did you try that route to make it a legal mandate? And if you didn't, what were some of the reasons why not?
Okay. All right. How shall we do this? Shall we do question by question, or do we have? We
can start. What I would suggest is for students and guests who have questions, if you could please raise your hand, and then I will moderate, and or use the chat function, please, and I'll keep an eye also on the chat for the questions. So we can start with this one, and maybe while you are answering my question, we can also talk a little bit about why you decided to go with the budget rather than a carved out separate budget, to make it part of the individual agencies. Did you think that would buy-in, or was it these fiscal constraints that you address? So let's start with those two questions, and then the students can use the raise hand function.
Okay. Yeah, so I think on the legal, I mean, yes, the Constitution, in South African Constitution, recognizes his right to work. It doesn't explicitly give the state the responsibility to realize that right. So there is a kind of fakeness to that. And but I think the other part, which very about in South Africa is the Constitution also talks about this progressive realization of rights. And so there are many rights in the Constitution. The South African Constitution is very progressive, coming out of, kind of this history. And so it's also recognizing that the government couldn't, there's also rights to clean water and rights to clean air and rights to social protection, rights to education. And the government is struggling with those, realizing many of those rights as well, partially because there's been such, it had such a large gap and had to come from so far behind. So the right is there, but it's sitting in a basket of many other rights that are to be realized, and many will argue, well, this is where you get into the fiscal debate. It's like, okay, well, is it more important to ensure people have water, or is it more important people have work? And so there is this. So this is one challenge there. We tried to, at the time when we said, let's put the notion of employment guarantee on the table, this notion of a legal right, but there was, the government was terrified at the time to make it a legal right to be. I think it went very quickly. And it's like, no, I think let's make it an implicit right. There was a lot of appetite for that, or try and realize this right, but we don't want to make it, the notion that people would take the government to court because they are not realizing this right was just, I think, it's quite scary for the government at the time, and I think probably still is. So I don't think there is much room there. So there may be other, that one could imagine some laws that more selectively give some rights to specific, but I think right like that wasn't really feasible at the time, I think. I think on the budget, I think the budget, there were a few things. One is that was this desire to decentralize the budget. That's how you get into politics and institutions here. That if you have one big budget and then one minister controls this budget, then you're at the mercy in some ways of that ministry and that minister. And so if it goes right, it's right, but if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. And so there is if you kind of decentralize the budget and you distribute it, then, if one ministry or one province or one municipality is not performing, you have many others who are able, who can perform. So there was a risk part to it. There was also risk. There was some experience with programs with a centralized budget before then. There was a community-based public works program before the WP. But there was this size, so fiscally, how big a budget, how big a fund would you create, and there was no appetite really to do that. But also, I think there was the other part, and it was the argument that was used most was this coordination activities that people said, well, if you give one agency or one ministry this budget to do all these things, then the situation you'll get, and which you had examples of in South Africa, is that out of this fund, somebody goes and builds a health clinic in some rural area because they have money to build a health clinic, but they don't talk to the Ministry of Health. And then the Ministry of Health doesn't plan to have nurses and doctors in this health clinic, and you have an empty health clinic. So if you build a health clinic, it has to be the Ministry of Health who built this clinic to make it function. If it's a school, you have to build the Ministry of Education has to build a school. So this was the other argument that was used at the time. So that if you create this fund that overlaps with the responsibility of other ministries, you're creating potentially chaos, or so this was kind of a mechanism to try and enforce that kind of coordination. As I said, there's kind of been a swing to that now. Now there are programs that are, for instance, the presidential deployment stimulus has dedicated funds there's been a mechanisms to manage that, but it's managed it's not managed by one ministry, but it's kind of collectively managed fund. So the institutional dimension is quite important, that there's a process where people submit proposals, and these proposals get approved by a cross-cutting set of different ministries have to sit on the board or in the process to decide who gets the funds. But it's a lot of that is to do with this ensuring you don't duplicate or create white elephants in the process of doing this. So that was the yeah, some of the thinking at the time.
Okay, thank you, Maikel, for that. And opening it up for other questions from the students. Please raise your hand. I see two in the chat. One is from Max from Taiwan. And he's saying, yeah, it's because we're recording, I'm just gonna read it. But basically the gist is now we are faced with COVID-related mass unemployment. Would employer of last resort employment guarantees would be the first way to address that problem, or are there other alternatives used before the employer of last resort function? That's okay. And the second is the question by Sikander from Afghanistan, and he's asking, are there downsides to running, implementing employer of last resorts?
Okay, so good question. So maybe I'll start with Max's question. Yeah, so I mean, this is happening as we speak, so this is kind of this real global experiment with how do we respond how do we respond to COVID? And we've been trying to track, are people using these programs, programs like this, to respond to COVID or not? And we have seen some interesting examples emerging. I think, so one, of course, the obvious limitation of these programs was that, on the one hand, government said in many countries, you have to stay home and not go to work. And then how did they then respond with a work-based program? And so you've seen actually, because then you expose people to the risk again of infection. And so initially, hardly any governments turned to these programs because of the kind of, the nature of the pandemic. And so rather we've seen a massive social protection responses in most countries where you had cash transfers, all over the world, or extended unemployment benefits, etc. So the first line of response in this case has actually been more social protection than public employment program, partially because of the public health concerns. Now that the public health concerns are, at least in some countries, being managed, I think it'll be interesting to see how the shift takes place. We have seen it. I mean, South Africa is a good example where we have seen such a shift, but there are other cases as well. I mean, we tried to do, as I mentioned, review some really interesting cases in Kenya, Nigeria, New Zealand. So there are countries who have responded with this, often from different dynamics. For instance, New Zealand, it was people who were in the tourism sector, which collapsed. So how do you maintain those people in work? How do you put those people to work? So then it's a very specific tourism sector employment, but it's like a public employment program for people who used to work in the tourism sector and now they're working on nature, basically, and nature restoration and environmental programs, which is interesting because it also then supports a big part of the New Zealand tourism is the nature and environment. So you kind of, at least, they stay within they're strengthening their own sector by working in the sector, and so that when tourism can open up again, you actually have improved or maintained the offering. So that's kind of and I think there will be more of that. I think as now it is also, in countries where unemployment remains high, and this is also interesting because it's going to be very different around the world for many reasons. But one would expect these programs to play a major role. Also, both from a economic kind of policy side, but also politically, I think there will be probably expectation that yes, we've given people social protection, we've sent people checks, we've given them transfers. There will be a political swing to say, okay, but now, enough of that. If people want income, they need to work, but then there's no jobs, then you come back very quickly to these programs. If the market doesn't offer these jobs and you want people to work for their living, then these are the programs that will come back. So I suspect there will be, but they will vary a lot. The question on the negative Yeah, there can be negative impacts. I think an important one is, and this is interestingly from our side and the ILO, so I'll talk from that perspective, and from the trade union side, I think it's the biggest fear of these programs perhaps is that, as I mentioned, this employment floor, that these programs effectively, they can set an employment floor by offering, if this program pays $10 an hour, you guarantee $10 an hour to anybody who wants to work, then who in the world will work for $9 an hour anywhere? You can always go to this program and get it for 10. So then you set this floor. Now, the fear from unions of that this floor, if you set this too low, that you're actually pushing the floor down. And so that actually may lead to deteriorating conditions for, and this is not only for, it's not only for the salary, of course, but all the other secondary benefits, whether it's health, contribution to Social Security, health and safety at work, the whole package of employment conditions. If the program sets it too low, there's a risk or a perceived risk that it will push the employment floor down. And actually, there's groups of society who may, you put downward pressure on wages, perhaps, and then people may be worse off. So this is one I think conceptual or fear that, and I think the other one, I think is for me, having worked kind of institutionally on this, is this point I mentioned earlier about can we, these programs should expand and contract depending on the labor market. And if people, if it's a last resort, and if I have a better job, I leave the program and I go somewhere else. But institutionally, we see that institutions clamor to not shrink and keep people there. There's a risk of that, so to speak. And I think this is one has to design the institution to be able to if it shrinks because there's no demand, if it shrinks because the minister cut the budget in half, then that's another problem. But a genuine shrinkage is a positive sign and should be interpreted as that. And it shouldn't be fear within institutions of that. So I think that's another.
Okay.
If it can be big enough to address structural poverty, yes, on its own, hard to say, but I think we should never see any policy. I don't think the expectation that any policy on its own is going to solve a problem as complex as structural poverty, I think is perhaps not too simplistic, but it is a pillar, that it's an element of it can be an element of that trajectory. But and we know in general that employment is the main root out of structural poverty. I think 99% of the case in the world, like it's people having better jobs and they work their way out of poverty. That's how if you have a crappy job or no job, you're poor basically. And if you have a good job, you're not. And so, its role in reshaping the labor market is actually the kind of really important thing. And there, this paper that I referred to in India on Narega is actually really fascinating because it shows the type of impacts and spillovers it can have. And that's not to say that Narega hasn't solved structural poverty in India. And no single program ever will, but because it's a problem of such epic scale, but it has made an important contribution there, and I think it's there. And I think from a policy perspective, it is what can it do? What can these programs do that other policies can't, right? And that's where that's what their role is. And I think if it's about creating better working conditions and better work opportunities for a group of people, then this is what these programs can do. And there's actually few other policies out there that have the same possibility.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm going to have Dennis ask his question. Dennis, if you want to, I see it in the chat, but go ahead. Dennis is from Bulgaria. He's joining from Bulgaria.
Hello, Professor Song. And so my question is basically, Professor Chelnova mentioned that you worked as a chief director of an employment guarantee initiative. And what was the biggest challenge you had to solve during your time?
Okay, thanks. That's a very good. I'm thinking very hard how to. Yeah. I mean, there are many, but I think I think one of the most challenging ones was surprisingly to me was often still being able to articulate what the limits of what can these programs do and can't, and in the sense that the question was always, oh, but you're creating these jobs, what happens to these people afterwards? What if the job ends? What did they get out of the program? What have you achieved? You're dumping people back into, you haven't solved structural poverty. You haven't. So people are my experience is people are looking for this, or have this expectation or looking for the solution that this thing is gonna change everything. And it's gonna, it makes yes. So articulating that it's not gonna take poor people who've never had a job and turn them into, and 2 months later they're gonna have a permanent job with a good salary, and like this kind of articulating the limits and still the achievements of the program, I think was perhaps the most challenging thing that was constantly a, kind of a battle. Like, it's good, but it's not good enough. And this, interestingly, especially a political question, So I think as we went through different ministers explaining that from the one minister to the next and how they see poverty eradication or poverty reduction, I think, and the role of employment. I think that was for me maybe the most. But it's not a very specific, incident, so to speak, if that's what you were.
I can imagine the list is long of challenges. Let's see, we have a guest from Ethiopia, Jote or Gira. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, good evening. In Ethiopia, we've seen several rounds of fiscal incentives to incentivize investments in the country, but we've yet to see incentives that direct at job creation and improvement of wages. And I know there is some kind of that incentive in South Africa. I'd like to hear his take on how successful that program was, or if it has failed, that would also be a good lesson to learn from.
And just to clarify, you're talking about these incentives programs in the private sector to create job creation within the private sector and incentivize them to increase wages there. Is that correct?
Exactly. What I want to know is, have there been successful programs that the government deployed their fiscal tools to encourage the private sector players to create jobs and pay better wages? And was there success in South Africa? Because he was part of the program in South Africa, I assume.
Very clear.
No, I can talk. This is an interesting question. I can talk maybe from a slightly different angle, because I think it was, in some ways, fiscally, we were often competing with these fiscal incentives, right? So people say, why are you spending money on a public employment program? Real jobs are in the private sector. So we're going to create a wage subsidy where the government will pay 50% of the wages for young people hired by the private sector. And that's much better to spend the money like that than to spend on a public employment program. This was a little bit so I was perhaps in this debate sitting on the other side of the table of these subsidies. So I have perhaps a tainted perspective on how well they work. But I think it's important to recognize where I was sitting in this debate. And I think that, again, there's a role. I know there was some attempts. I think there was. It never really went to big scale in South Africa. These subsidies. I think there are challenges both there's one challenge on administration and always there's the fear of, okay, but if you give me incentive for the wage subsidy, I'm just gonna, if I don't need anybody, I'm just gonna fire this other guy, hire this guy, and I'm gonna use the subsidy to lower my wage bill. I mean, this is the worst case scenario of wage subsidies, right? That people are are scared of, that you're subsidizing displacement, you're not subsidizing new job creation. So that's kind of so this was always a little bit the fear, and again, from the unions in South Africa, this was the real fear about the wage subsidy. Say, okay, all you're gonna do is just, displace. So this was at the time. I haven't really followed what has happened and how well it's worked. In South Africa, so I can't really, say much more than that. I can just kind of give you my experience at the time. But I'm sure there's some literature on it, and it's a big field in many ways. But yes, I know in South Africa, or in Africa in general, it's come up in many cases, but I don't have that much.
Yeah. Thank you. And also, just to interject here, it's very interesting, and I'm wondering if you're observing this too, that there seems to be a bit of a shift in mood and the unions. The Service Employee International Union has endorsed the job guarantee, the European Trade Union Confederation as well. I had done a presentation before the largest Italian trade union, and it seems to be movement, a little bit of movement there. I don't know if you're seeing.
Yes, I think there is open. I think there's never fundamental opposition to it, because I think, but it's just always this fear. So I think it's a little bit like, we need to trust that you're going to design it in such a way and implement it in such a way, and that it's it's going to start. And there's this fear that it gets hijacked and gets designed in a way that actually, I think this is the. So I think, and this is again, having unions part of the process and having them at the table, and is I think politically critical to getting it off the ground. But yes, I think there could be more.
Right, Hamid, are you with us? Do you want to ask your question? Not sure if Hamid is with us. Sometimes there are connection issues, but I will read it. He's asking, what mitigation schemes should the ILO, along with the NRDC, take that lead to employment gains and prevent job losses, as climate change and environment issues seem to affect public employment, or are there types of collaborative actions between the two that can take? Okay,
maybe the NRDC.
The climate, it escapes me, the climate, what does it stand for? The
nationally determined contributions.
Huh?
I know NDCs, which are the nationally determined contributions.
Natural resource, the acronym is escaping me. Natural resource,
Defense Council.
Defense. I was like, what is the T stand? Natural Resource Defense.
Okay. No, I'm
sorry, Professor, I just lost connection. Yeah.
I think that's the one you mean, right? It's
okay. I think it's here.
Yeah, the Natural Resource Defense Council. Yeah, right.
Okay. Is that a US?
It's an international-based organization.
I think it's an international and global kind of institution, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's different specifically, but I think within the, this is within the whole climate adaptation and mitigation space. I think this is of course a very interesting space we've been following, because what is it, and you see it in the US as well, like what is the job potential, or what's going to happen if we make this shift in terms of actually doing the mitigation and adaptation requirements that are required according to Paris Agreement, etc. What will that mean for jobs? This is a huge question, and we've done a lot of work in there to see what are the measures. I focus mostly on adaptation, and I think the general findings so far that there's important net gains. That yes, many jobs will be lost, but many more will be gained. I mean, this is really what most studies and research is telling us up to now. And yeah, I mean, there are some sectors that identify that have real big potential adaptation. It's, housing and buildings and what you call that, climate proofing buildings and stuff like that. That's in many countries a big job creator potentially. Renewable energy, a bit less, but there is some work on that, and there are these sectors that are identified as as really big job creators. If that's kind of the question, and we collaborate a lot with these environmental institutions on that, in this whole space of green jobs and public employment programs that focus on the environment. And there's, I think one of the biggest one is on ecosystem restoration. I think that has the potential of really large job creation, especially in rural areas, and less people to work on that. I think is massive. So that could be, that's an area to explore.
Yeah, and you talked a bit about the pandemic. I think that's the last question that we have from Hosanna. And you know, as you mentioned, climate work is also is better done in the midst of a pandemic than office work. So I don't know if you wanted to add any more on the post-pandemic recovery.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think on the post-pandemic, I think the big question with the pandemic recovery is that there's now, I mean, there are many ambitions on the pandemic recovery. So, you know, there's this green recovery should be green and building back better. It's, you know, be more socially just. So I think, and of course, you know, these things that many of us imagined when the pandemic hit, of that we, you know, when we come out in a better world, kind of is still very strong, but you know, at least on the green side, a lot of the money spent is not so much, you know, far less of the money spent is actually on green or on climate related investments than we had hoped. I think the jury on jobs will be, is you know, how much it will actually be spent on real kind of restructuring the labor market and creating jobs. I think is still, I think the jury is kind of still out, and I think it's, you know, but every country has its story here. There's no, you know, at some point it becomes a national politics, right? And I think it becomes, so then every, yeah, so it's, but it's something we watch with great interest and try and where we can influence and contribute to, of course.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Maikel. We are now past the top of the hour. I really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise. You know, we study a lot of these theoretical, aspirational proposals, you know, big picture, envisioning how public employment can transform work for many, but I just really value your experience and sharing it with us today. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All. And take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Professor?
Yes.
Sorry, I just had a question about the analysis that we are having for each session. You know, I'm kind of having a hard time with the word limits. You know, sometimes I have to explain more things. You know, are we restricted and constrained to just write 500 words, or there's no actual word limitation?
There is no, there isn't a word limit. It's really more of a guide just to tell you that the expectation isn't that you're not writing long research papers, but by all means, if you need to take a little bit more to explain your arguments, I welcome that.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.